Hey guys, it's Leah B from Prestige Veteran Medical Consulting. I am a U.S. Army veteran, physician assistant, and former compensation and pension examiner. Today I have Rebecca Deming from ProVet Legal on to discuss VA math, which is a super complex issue, I think, for a lot of veterans out there, self-included. So Rebecca has been on before. She's a VA accredited attorney out of Florida. She represents veterans everywhere in the United States. And I'm going to just turn it over to you for those viewers that aren't familiar with you, Rebecca, so you can tell us a little bit about yourself before we jump in.
Sure. Okay, Leah, thanks for having me back on. It's great to be here and chat with you. VA math is definitely something that we get a lot of questions about, so I'm glad that you're doing this episode. I opened ProVet Legal in June of 2021, but I've been working with military in civil military operations kind of settings for about a decade before I got into VA law. In 2019 is when I started doing it full time, and that's really all that our firm does is help veterans fight the VA to prove the disabilities that they are entitled to and get the benefits that they deserve.
Sure. And you represent veterans, like I mentioned, everywhere. You've even had some veterans overseas that you've assisted with things. So, you don't have to be in Florida to utilize Rebecca's services or any VA attorney services. They can, if they're accredited by the Office of General Counsel, can represent veterans in all the states and worldwide, basically. So
Right.
I wanted to jump in and sort of ask you the first question about VA math, because VA math, it's not just 50 plus 50 equals 100, and we're going to get into some of that and take a look at Rebecca's awesome tool that she has on her website, also an interactive tool that you guys can use to sort of look at the numbers. But can you explain how VA disability rating system calculates overall disability percentages for veterans?
Sure. So first of all, it's important to understand that VA follows their own regulations, their own internal regulations regarding how they rate each disability. So every disability is rated on a scale of, we say 10 to 100, but really 0 to 100, and in increments of 10. And then so if you have multiple disabilities, you might have one with a 10 and two with 20s and 50s. You don't just add those up. VA uses a formula, what they call combined rating formula, to give a full picture. And then depending on where those numbers fall, when you combine them using their formula, you round up or down to get the next higher level. So nobody's gonna be rated 25% disabled.
Sure.
If your numbers added to 25, you would be rounded up to 30.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's really sort of easier to understand if you can see it. So I'd like to pull up your tool that you have on your website so we can kind of go over that and let our viewers take a look. So hang on one second. So if you guys jump over to provetlegal.com, this is Rebecca's website. You can see her About Us section here. You can expand it and see information about Rebecca and her, the other attorney that works in her firm, Sarah Brock, who's wonderful. Their contact information, their free case review. You can schedule, a call with them as well. But here you have this VA disability calculator tool. And can you sort of walk me through this tool for veterans to use?
Sure. So when you're combining ratings, and you can do this on paper yourself if you like to geek out with math and really enjoy it. But I think having a tool helps people, especially if you got multiple ratings, you're trying to figure out what your combined rating is. So you want to start with the highest rating that you have, and then you add the rest in. And so you've got those numbers on the bottom. On the top, you've got left leg, left arm, right arm. Those buttons are for if you have bilateral factor. So, and I know we're gonna talk more about bilateral factor in another video, Leah. But essentially, it's important to understand that you can get a bump up if you have disabilities on both the right and the left arms or right and left legs. And so you want to make sure that you're using the tool correctly to capture that so that the math ends up right and you get an accurate picture of what your combined rating is going to be.
Sure.
So, so then you would click your rating from highest to lowest. So let's say you've got 70% for PTSD,
Okay.
and then 50% for migraines,
Okay.
50% for sleep apnea.
Sure.
So let's scroll down, and you'd see that
Okay.
that equals 90%.
Yeah, that's awesome. So you can see that it's 90%. You can see that what the current monthly payments are. This is, probably going to change shortly, based on the cost of living allowance increases coming up in 2025, but this is the current rates. And so if we take away a 50%, like let's say they're just pending their sleep apnea, but they haven't gotten it yet. This is what it shows that it didn't really move it much. And I want to ask you
Right.
some questions about that specifically. But go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Yeah, no, so that's actually a great example. Um, so because 90% is really the area where stuff can get sticky in VA math. I mean, it can get sticky anywhere. So to kind of take a step back and talk about the math behind this calculator.
Sure.
So your VA uses what's called a whole person approach.
Mhm.
So when they're combining ratings, they're using the whole person approach. So you start off with somebody who's essentially not disabled, and then you're adding a disability to that. So let's say you've got someone who's got one disability that's 50% disabling. Now, the whole person, you take 50% away from 100, you've got 50% left. So if you take another 50% and add that on,
Okay.
it's going to be 80%. But really what it is, it's 75% rounded up to 80. So you take the first one. I kind of like to think of it like the elementary school math problem where you're taking a pizza pie and you remove half of the pizza pie, you've got half left. Now you remove
Right.
half of what's left. That's 25%. So you're taking the 25% plus the original 50%, and that's a 75% rating added up, rounded up to 80%. Now, if you add
Yeah.
on one more 50%, you're taking half of what's left, half of a half, you've got 25% left. So you're going to take the next half is 12.5%. So that's going to round you up to 90%. But it's really 87.5%.
Right. And so I was going to ask you about that because, 50 plus 50 is 75%, which rounds up to 80. 50 plus 50 plus 50 would then be 87.5%, as you mentioned, rounded up to 90. So can you tell me, a quick breakdown of how the rounding works?
Sure.
Can a
So
person be
VA rounds.
75%?
So like I think I mentioned that you're always going to get an even number. So you're always going to
Mhm.
be 10, 20, 30, 40. You're never going to be in the middle when VA pays you. They pay you at the even number, but they'll
Mhm.
round up or down based on simple rounding principles. So if it's a 5 or higher, it gets rounded up. So 85 gets rounded up to 90. 84 gets rounded down to 80.
Okay, so a person could be 86% and another person could be 94%, which is kind of a really big difference, but they're both going to round to 90, essentially.
Right. And we see that a lot. People will come to us, come to our office, and they say, I'm 90% disabled. What do I need to do if I want to get to 100%? Or with the disabilities I have, can I get to 100%?
Right.
And if all I know is that you're 90%, it's going to be really hard for me to answer that question because I
Mhm.
don't know kind of what's on the table and where you're falling. And if you're 94% disabled, it might just be that we need to get 10% for tinnitus, and that's all that we need, and that's going to put you to 95, which we will round up to 100%.
Okay.
But if you're 86% and we add, like with this one, let's add one more 50%. The person's 87.5, so let's add one more 50. They're still at 90% because it's half of the remaining 12.5% is 6.25
Mhm.
added to 87. We're looking at roughly 94%
93,
here.
94. Yeah. So I have a couple more questions, but before we jump to those, I just want to highlight, not only does this do math, but it sort of tells you those payments, those estimated payments. And here in this section 2, there's a little section on dependents, which can influence what this value is here, right?
Right. So if you're rated 10 or 20%, the number is not going to change with dependents. But once you hit 30% or higher with a disability rating, the numbers will change slightly based on the number of dependents that you have. And so if you have a spouse and 3 children, or a dependent parent who lives with you that you're caring for, the number will slightly go up.
So like, here's your single veteran at 90%. Here's your at 2172. Here's your married veteran. And you can see that adjustment. And then you said, let's say three dependents under the age of 18. And there's the value that pops up for that. So it's pretty cool.
Right.
So let me stop this screen share real quick. So we talked about rounding. So I know we talked about bilateral factor really briefly. We're going to do a whole nother video on this, but do you have any just quick tidbits or quick tips about bilateral factor and how this can, assess?
So sometimes bilateral factor won't make a difference in your overall combined rating, kind of depending on where you fall with the rounding. But sometimes that bilateral factor is what makes the difference between the next higher rating or the lower rating, rounding up or rounding down. And so basically what it is you get a slight bump up, and we'll talk about how that math works in the next video. But you get a slight bump up if you have a condition that affects basically both arms or both legs. And it can be different parts. It's kind of, when I say arms, it's anything shoulder to hands, and legs, anything hips to toes. So you could have a right knee and a left ankle. That's going to be enough to trigger the bilateral factor, and you get a slight bump up. And so that's just going to slightly change the way that those calculations are done. And sometimes will result in, if you're 94, it might be enough to bump you to 95%. And so someone who has bilateral factor might get the next higher rating.
So sort of wrapping up, I have like an overall question for you. What kind of advice would you give to a veteran that believes that the VA math has not been done accurately, or they have a question about that?
Yeah, we're always happy to look at a rating decision. I would say start by calling VA and asking for a copy of the most recent code sheet, and you might be able to pull it up on va.gov to pull up the list of all of the conditions that you have. And then you can plug that into a calculator, or you can run the numbers like we talked about to figure out if VA's math with the whole person comes out to be correct. But if you have any questions about it, I say it's always worth calling an attorney's office, because if we can't help you, we'll let you know, we'll run those numbers and say, nope, you're actually, that's right. They didn't pay you for tinnitus because it moved you from 58 to 63%. Either way, it's rounded to 60, so that's correct. And we'll just let you know, and we won't open your file. And it's not going to cost you anything to get that opinion.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for kind of shining a light and shedding some light on this topic, because it is super overwhelming and confusing. But I think, the key is not to be an expert and a math whiz at this, but to know that there's tools out there to help you sort of figure that out, and where to find the tools that can help you get a better understanding of your personal VA disability. Right. So thank you for creating that tool. Thank you for your time today. Do you have any last words for our viewers?
Don't get overwhelmed, everyone. Just, it can be kind of overwhelming when you start talking math, and a lot of people shut down. But when you start playing around with your own numbers, I think it starts to make sense. And if you have questions, reach out.
Okay. So if you guys want to reach out to Rebecca, you can find her at ProVet Legal. We're going to drop a link to her website in the description of this video. So thank you so much for tuning in. Please like and subscribe. And if you have any other topics you'd like to hear about from Rebecca, please, feel free to drop those comments as well. So thanks everybody for watching, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thanks, Leah.